The Flash's final season is comprised of 13 episodes, which are separated into arcs. The first arc, which are the first 5 episodes, is called Rogue War, but features the Red Death as the main villain. I made a video going over and reviewing that arc, as well as the individual episodes if you want to watch those, but then there is also the 4-episode long interlude, made up entirely of filler episodes, although one of them is pretty damn good. And finally, this brings us to the second arc of the season, which is also the final arc of the show, known as A New World, featuring Cobalt Blue as the main villain. And while the arc had a promising start, like Zoom, Eric Wallace just gave us hope so that he could tear it away, as any hope for a satisfying conclusion to this show was spectacularly swept away in the subsequent episodes. This video is a review of the Flash's 4 final episodes, which together make up the arc known as A New World. As mentioned, the arc started rather strong, with an episode focusing almost entirely on Barry Allen as the Flash, finally going full circle to the night that Nora Allen died, in such a way that was both unexpected but also satisfying, where Barry is perceived to have won in the end that night, not Thawne, and I actually love that conclusion. I'm very satisfied with it a month later as well. Matt Letscher is finally, thankfully, allowed to return to playing the classic Eobard Thawne in his full glory, which is the first time this is one single episode in the entirety of Eric Wallace's run where Eobard Thawne truly landed as the character he once was in seasons 1, 2, and 3, as well as in Legends of Tomorrow season 2. Basically, since then, there's always been some sort of caveat that was wrong with him, but this one episode, this was perfect. This was Eobard Thawne. I wish we had more of Matt Letscher's take on the character and more of the pre-season 1 era of Thawne. The episode definitely had its faults, especially in these unusual Henry and Nora Allen interactions with Barry, where they seem to care a bit too much about this stranger, and an overall lack of action in a story we really thought 9 years ago would be a very high-stakes event. But these are, admittedly, relatively minor complaints in an overall fantastic episode that I believe successfully brought the Flash full circle. If this arc did anything well, it's that. Unfortunately for the arc, however, while the episode does feature parts of Eddie's origin story leading up to this really cool reversal of Barry's origin, the main Thawne-related plot is almost entirely unconnected to the arc itself. It is definitely because of certain events in this arc that the plot of this episode happens, but the part of the episode that's so great doesn't really contribute to the overarching plot of this arc. What I'm trying to say here is while the episode might boost the average of these 4 episodes by quite a bit, it'll be helping the actual final score of the arc a bit less due to it being somewhat standalone. Not entirely, but somewhat. As I said, Eddie's character is focused on quite a bit in this side storyline of the episode, which does effectively set up the arc's main villain, even if he definitely needed a bit more episodes to actually be the main villain, which is a complaint that is a not very small one, which I'll return to later. Now, you might have noticed that up until this point, I've kind of just talked about just the first episode in such a way that feels entirely separate from the rest of the arc, and there's definitely a reason for that. I'm not going to be talking about each episode individually here in this video because I already did that with my episode reviews. The reason I'm just talking about the first episode separately is because it is separate, not just in the plot being less connected, but also it's just more competently made. It's better written, a more well thought out story than the rest of the arc. It kind of feels like a completely different show. Maybe the show The Flash should be, you know, a show that actually knows who its main character is. This is probably the biggest issue with the Cobalt Blue arc. Barry Allen just doesn't feel like the main character. It kind of feels like Eric Wallace considers this show an ensemble, where every character, or at the very least alongside Barry, Keon, and Cecile, deserve to have an equal amount of screen time and episodes dedicated to them. It's kind of been that way since season 7, but the closer and closer we get to the ending of the show, the less and less episodes we have, the worse and worse it becomes when Barry is just not around. He's not showing up. Barry appears in the last 10 minutes of the second episode because they had this ingenious idea of episode 2 happening parallel to episode 1, focusing on Keon as the main character. Then in episode 3, he doesn't appear until around 20 minutes in, but even then, he proceeds to remain a secondary character to Cecile. Finally, the series finale feels not like an episode of The Flash, but more like a superhero team show, where Barry is, yes, the leader, but every one of these characters gets to contribute equally equally. And sure, that would be cool if they did effectively build up a superhero team throughout this show, but Team Flash consists of the lamest, most ill-conceived, and poorly developed superheroes in TV history, rivaled by the later seasons of Legends of Tomorrow. This is a huge problem. Not only is the main character not really the main focus of the final arc of his own show, which was kind of true for the final few episodes of Arrow as well, but that was after an entire season of build-up to his death, and every episode focused on him, but even after he did die, the series finale still managed to be about Oliver, but also, aside from that, the characters that they do tend to pivot focus to are simply a terrible group of characters, born out of what seems to be Eric Wallace's dream of adding anything at all to DC canon. Before he became the Flash showrunner, he created Allegra Garcia as a comic writer, and as the showrunner, he has tried to make her a thing, and while also turning Cecile into a completely different character, creating a completely original character named Keon, who kind of becomes more important than Barry in the future. None of these things started in this arc, but the supporting cast are an overarching problem that pollutes the very essence of this show, and it becomes especially egregious when they are given the spotlight or go through some sort of development in their careers, like learning that they are goddesses or getting an ugly-ass superhero costume as a 75-year-old woman in 2049, but also having that costume in the present. It's these irrelevant and nonsensical concoctions that fill up the runtime of these episodes with the most skippable content in this show's history, that are also actively detracting from the validity of the Arrowverse as a legitimate DC universe, and now it's kind of just a parody. I mean, because of the third episode in this arc, this is now a universe where Batman is this unimportant hero, Green Arrow was around for like 8 years, but Cecile Horton's superhero career lasts around 30 years at the very least. The whole 2049 visit has gotta be the stupidest and laziest story this show has ever produced. They did not attempt to make anyone look older, and just the fact that after 26 years, Cecile and Allegra are both still active, but also Cecile has not gotten a new costume yet, or a superhero name, it's so ridiculous. I struggle to even accept its canonicity. I don't understand the writing process here. It just feels like they don't know how long from now 2049 is. It feels like they think it may be next year. It's 26 years from now. What are you talking about? Then there's Keon's whole ascended godhood, which is now overshadowing Flash's importance to this universe, leading to this very unearned, unemotional, and disturbing, if you think about it, return of Caitlin after a whole year where Keon just hijacked her body. Her death was so incredibly poorly handled that her return could never really do anything but fall flat. Why should I care that she's now back when the characters themselves did not care that she died, aside from this one episode that aired 2 months later where they finally addressed that Barry cares? Allegra Chester and especially Chillblaine kind of don't do anything in this arc aside from maybe a fight or two, which even that Chillblaine doesn't do, which I guess is kind of a good thing. I'd rather they do nothing than do something, but at the same time, why even be there at that point? What is exactly the point of them? Chillblaine especially, he kind of came back after a few episodes of not being around just to do nothing. Iris also does a surprisingly small amount of things as she's relegated to a worried wife who's about to give birth. It's definitely the most effective and relevant of all the side character stories, and the only one that I really cared about and was invested in, but it's such a shame, and it's an embarrassing one at that Cecile and Keon, whoever that is, had larger roles than Iris West in the final arc of The Flash. This kind of already makes this arc lower than average by default. Having an arc or even an episode focusing on anyone but Barry hasn't really been anything good since like season 6. It's always been bad, but this time around it's insulting. It's the final goddamn arc. This is it. This is the end, and half of these episodes aren't even about Barry. It's such a sad ending to this character, a character who is played by such a fantastic actor. Grant Gustin does a fantastic job in these episodes. As I mentioned in my series finale review, he's been the single consistently great part of this show, aside from the music, basically throughout the entire 9-season run. Even with all the awful dialogue, the most poorly conceived stories, Grant Gustin always gives it his all. This is especially true for this final arc, where in the relatively small amount of time that focuses on him, you can feel the emotion coming off of Barry. It's the only time you feel anything. Grant Gustin is doing his best to carry this arc on his back. Unfortunately, however, it's not nearly enough. You can't do that by yourself. After 9 seasons of a show that's been incredibly important to me leading into this final arc, not just the ending of The Flash, but the Arrowverse, the whole universe that this channel has been built on from the start, I just didn't feel anything in this arc due to the show ending. Well, that's not necessarily true. The first episode does a great job with this, with the Flash coming full circle, but episodes 2 and 3 are wholly empty voids when it comes to emotion, and the series finale had maybe 1 or 2 scenes that made me feel anything when it showcased Barry and Iris' happy ending, and this is almost entirely due to my emotional connection to Grant Gustin's portrayal of the character as he does his damnedest at making the shitty dialogue work. Barry has not been the most consistent in the writing department, and it's with a heavy heart that I say that this final arc absolutely failed Barry Allen as a character, even when he is on screen. Again, not counting the first episode, which treated Barry and his story fantastically. Barry is pretty consistently jobbed in these final episodes, whether that be in a fight where he's pretty quickly defeated by a negative Speed Force XS, and then needs to be saved by Virtue, or when he's quickly defeated by Cobalt Blue, who's been a speedster for like 2 days and needs to be saved by XS, to finally not even, and this really pissed me off, he wasn't even allowed to come up with the idea to defeat the final main villain of this show. That was Keon, and even the idea was so simple and easy. This final arc showcases the worst of the treatment of the Flash, as he's not portrayed as a competent leader or hero, is easily defeated by much less experienced speedsters, and needs his friends to come up with how to defeat the final villain. Again, it's just so sad. This show has had a lot of complaints. A very consistent one has been how inconsistent Barry is, and sadly the final arc just showcases how inconsistent this character can be, as in episode 1, in part 1, he's fantastic. He knows what he's doing. He's a badass and he wins. Episode 2 and 3 and 4, he's just a loser. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's easily defeated, and it's so goddamn disappointing. Eddie Thawne, also known as Cobalt Blue, despite all of his powers being red, wasn't necessarily an awful main villain like Red Death was, but as the final main villain of the show, he's very underwhelming. The arc is only 4 episodes long, which was a very weird and stupid decision for the structure of this season. They made the real-life decision, they actually did this, to dedicate the same amount of episodes towards filler between the arcs that they dedicated to the final arc of this show. Also, the final 4 episodes do not make the most of their runtimes when it comes towards the development of its main villain. Part 1 spends most of its time showing Eddie prior to being hit by lightning, which in retrospect, kind of pointless. Episode 2 is all about Eddie remembering his old life, and it wasn't until like the second half of episode 3, after this very weird motivation building of being showed a potential daughter who looks exactly like Nora for some reason, where Eddie actually began to become villainous. There was only like an episode and a half where Barry was even aware of Eddie's existence, in just a single episode, just the series finale, where Eddie was actually allowed to be an actual villain, and even there, the conflict ends around 25 minutes in. Basically, what I'm saying is, Cobalt Blue is given such a small amount of time to be an actual threat, a far too small amount of time to build up any interesting rivalry with Barry, and a far too small amount of time for the final conflict of the show to actually hit home. The stakes of the final episode was the destruction of the timeline, but like 10 minutes in, it's revealed that Eddie is just gonna go kill himself after they easily defeated the Legion of Zoom, which would end the conflict, and the stakes changed to something that's intended to be more personal, especially with Barry not wanting Eddie to die, but it simply doesn't work because of the insanely short amount of time we've spent with this Eddie. I, as an audience member, I just don't care if he dies or not. I just don't buy into these personal stakes. I think this also might be because Eddie just feels like a different person. I think Rick Cosnett might have had a difficult time slipping back into this role because the way he acts, the way he talks, even if mildly different, he simply just feels like a different person compared to Eddie from season 1. What this gives us is a completely new character we're asked to already be emotionally invested in, who's just not given the amount of time needed to develop into the villain they want him to be. Instead, he's forced into becoming that villain very, very quickly, not helped at all by not great acting and awful dialogue. The general idea of Cobalt Blue was decent, and I will say his costume was fantastic, but the final villain of this show is yet another failed villain in the long list of awful main villains in Eric Wallace's Flash career. I don't understand how he knocked it out of the park with blood work on his first try, but after that, since then, none of them have been great, and a lot of them have been genuinely awful. I don't really expect anything from this show visually speaking anymore. The cinematography has gotten worse and worse over the years as this show is shot like and people move around like Power Rangers, and with the Power Rangers level writing, it kind of just is at that level. The silver lining of the visuals of this show, however, is Flash's costume. The gold boots added in season 8 perfected this design to the point where it's probably the single best thing about this show alongside Grant Gustin, and to the point where it's consistently carrying the show visually as it looks great in most shots and tends to look incredible when in the correct lighting. It's a very easy and cheap way to make up for some of this show's visual shortcomings, including in this arc, but it's simply, like Grant Gustin, it's not enough. It's something, it's not nothing, but it's not enough alone. This arc's fight scenes are very up and down. By that I mean not very high highs, but very low lows. There is a good amount of speedster fights, with the Flash vs. XS fight being a highlight, but these fights are pretty consistently just like 1 minute long, with this being a shortcoming of even part 1, but also most of them are just pretty terrible as well, mostly because the CGI in this arc, especially in the finale, is atrocious. Whether it be Barry or Cobalt Blue or Zoom, the speedsters in the finale tend to look like PS2 graphics, with these embarrassingly bad CGI scenes. Then, outside of the speedster versus speedster fight scenes, all the rest of the action in this arc is god-awful. Part 2 doesn't really have any. Cecile taking down negative Speed Force XS is vomit-inducing, and don't get me started on the fight scenes of the series finale. Keon taking down this parody of Zoom is very anticlimactic. XS's fight with Savitar lasted maybe 12 seconds. Allegra fighting Thawne was kind of just people standing around, and the Cecile vs. Godspeed fight is legitimately the single worst fight scene in this show's history, as Cecile just kind of pushes the air in different directions around her, which for some reason one-shots all these Godspeeds who simply aren't able to outspeed this normal moving person. It also just looks so stupid. So yeah, in spite of the fantastic Flash suit and even Cobalt Blue looking great, these things do help a bit. The visuals as well as the fight scenes of this arc are just as bad, if not worse, than the typical Flash visuals and fight scenes of the last few years. Aside from the writing and visuals making the show feel like Power Rangers, the show just kind of gives off the vibe that the writers think this show's audience are a bunch of toddlers, whether that be Cecile telling us how certain characters are feeling, insulting the audience's intelligence, which is a problem that has persisted basically since she began to do that whenever that was, and that's certainly an issue in this arc, but a more prominent issue for this arc, just like the Red Death arc, is the goddamn flashbacks. Like in the previous arc, the show, especially in this final season, would often call back to previous episodes or previous seasons, and this became even more prevalent in this arc with this heavy connection to season 1. The issue here is that every time they do call back to anything, they show a flashback with this ugly ass blue tint because they just don't trust the audience remembers anything from their show, or maybe are intelligent enough to understand the callback without actually showing us what they're calling back to. It's so annoying. It may be a personal pet peeve. I just can't stand it. I can't stand the writers treating their audience like unintelligent children. It's genuinely insulting. The arc is like 10% flashback, as some of them are actually a part of the plot, but even still, it's just not what you want to see while watching this show. A standout moment is from part 3, where they flash back to this one already ridiculous moment from earlier in the episode. Not once, but twice. It's such a ridiculous, insulting, and generally unpleasant late addition to this show. In conclusion, the Cobalt Blue arc, or A New World, or the series finale arc of the show, is an embarrassing ending to not just the final season of The Flash, not just The Flash as a whole, but the Arrowverse as a whole, with the general prevailing issues of the latter seasons of this show, like terrible writing, awful cinematography, a god-awful supporting cast, an inconsistent Barry Allen, and writers who treat their audience like idiots, with the generous addition of an underwhelming final villain, extra extra bad CGI, a too short runtime, too small presence for the main character, and a too large presence for both Keone and Cecile, complete with the ruining of many previous main villains and contributing greatly to the illegitimacy of the Arrowverse as a legitimate DC universe. The most unconnected first part greatly helps this arc in what is really a far more effective finale, but what this first episode does is help this arc go from a horrendous arc to something just mildly better, something that's simply bad. I'd give the final arc of The Flash a 4 out of 10, a sad ending to a once great show that I'll try to remember fondly, but it might just be the music, Flash's costume, and the casting of Grant Gustin that I'll be able to unconditionally praise.